Okay. Well, I've had Kiri in several sessions, and you were there yesterday, and you were also there in the summer, correct? Okay. So Lindsay and Kiri known. So I'll try to kind of balance raw introduction with deep experience, so to speak. So the one way to think about this is that at the high school, in preparation for advanced placement tests, I'm going to focus on the people I've not yet worked with, and we'll bring you two into it in a bit. One needs a lot more thinking, talking, practice of active learning. And so I'll talk about it more in the keynote, but I think the direct instruction is useful and appropriate for younger children, and at some point in preparation for high school, college, and beyond, we need to kind of transition to kind of learning where the students are much more active. So one of the things that we'll do, I'll go ahead and hand this out so you can have a little bit of experience. You guys were already in this, so I didn't realize you'd be there. Are you going to sit in, or?
I have to see on her schedule.
Okay, no problem.
I am to the extent that I don't.
Okay. So you guys are already experts on the nationalism conversation.
Well,
but
I wouldn't call us experts.
So the basic format, I spent 4 years at a college called St. John's, where we read and talk about texts all the time, classic works of Western civilization. So starting with Homer, Plato, Aeschylus, so forth on into the 20th century. And every class we would read a classic text and discuss it in class and then write papers on it. And I happen to love this kind of learning. It turns out that when you take an advanced placement test, whether it's history or literature or even biology, the test often consists of writing an essay in response to prompts. And there is no right answer. You're expected to demonstrate deep knowledge, but in the course of understanding deep knowledge, you have to have your own thesis and defend your own thesis in your own way. And so it's the sort of thing where you can't simply memorize information in order to prepare for that. You need to practice articulating a thesis and defending a thesis over and over and over again. And so this is an activity that helps students develop this experience in articulating a thesis of their own making and then defending it in light of the evidence. I think it's also enjoyable, and it allows students to argue about various ideas that might be important to them. So just as that was a super quick introduction, and the experienced people can too, but any questions or comments on that basic background? Okay. Well, one of the things we did yesterday with the faculty is read this little piece on nationalism and have a little conversation on it. And so, again, you guys are veterans, but we can go ahead and do it again. So I always like to have students read to have practice. So you want to read the first paragraph, Beth?
Oh, sure. The term nationalism is generally used to describe state phenomena. The attitudes that the members of a nation have when they care about national identity, and the actions that the members of a nation take when seeking to achieve or sustain self-determination. Raises the questions about the concept of a nation or national identity, which is often defined in terms of common origin, ethnicity, or cultural ties. And while an individual membership as a nation is often regarded as involuntary, it is sometimes regarded as voluntary. It raises questions about whether self-determination must be understood as involving having full statehood with complete authority over domestic and international affairs, or whether something is less required.
And that's probably enough for this small group. So how would you explain the main point of that paragraph? What is that paragraph saying?
Well, I think it's saying generally like nationalism is basically, not basically, but as far as I understand it, the attitude of the people together in a nation, or the attitude.
Okay.
And it's individualistic to community, like how the community kind of perceives their nationalism, their identifiers, or...
So do you think of people as choosing their nationalism, or is nationalism you're born with? I mean, what's the individual's relationship to nationalism?
I think a good part of it has to be not only with the culture that they're raised in, but also their commonalities and experiences. I would say, orphans of history. We're raised, saying the Pledge of Allegiance, and that's something we sort of recognize as being, part of our nationality, our culture, and representing our nation. So I'm thinking it's also the same thing for
It wasn't just one story, it was all
for
about
other areas or for other groups. It's their experiences plus what they accept as being
especially.
their culture is defined by.
So how you're raised determines your nationality?
The issue,
Not necessarily.
Okay.
maybe by the
I'd say it's partly,
Mm-hmm.
but
and maybe shortly, I bet he would,
can't really think of any
allow
innate or
If-
genetic factors that would determine nationality. So I'm thinking it's probably a good portion of how you're raised,
David has, done a lot of
your experiences.
Your experiences? And then if when it says it's often regarded as involuntary, it is sometimes regarded as voluntary. If it's based on your experiences, how can it be voluntary?
That would be like joining the military, kind of like
Okay.
voluntarily, I mean, not necessarily like a draft. Involuntary, but joining the military, something that you based on your experience, maybe.
That would be a voluntary manifestation of your nationalistic feeling?
Well, how involved you choose to be
Is voluntary. But if your nationalistic impulse is based on your culture, good morning.
One has what time it was.
It's a little bit after 10:30.
Oh, we're good.
It's
Okay, thank you.
10:37. Yeah,
Sorry to
that's okay. That's okay. So you can choose voluntarily how deeply to be in your voluntarism or nationalism, but you're saying if you're raised with it, then it's just involuntary because that's the way you were raised.
Well, I think it shapes who you are and how, to what extent you express your nationality. Like your experiences can define how you perceive it to be. And I think it's sort of a choice as to how you practice or how much you invest in characteristics.
A friend of mine is Bosnian and came here after conflicts in Bosnia, and he considers himself, because he is a U.S. citizen now, he considers himself American, but other people, specifically his family, consider themselves and him Bosnian. So I think that it's his choice to consider himself American, and that's where the difference comes from. You may be raised in one nationality, but that choice comes from who you identify with.
So in a way, you're using that particular individual as a case of both voluntary and involuntary nationalism, because you would say he's involuntarily Bosnian, and no matter what he says, but he's voluntarily American, but that's also legitimate, is what you're saying. Do you accept Lindsay's, that you can both voluntarily and involuntary? And then it says, part 2 raises questions about whether self-determination must be understood as involving having full statehood with complete authority over domestic and international affairs, or whether something less is required. So, first of all, what do they mean by self-determination and nationalism?
no, he's a newspaper. So he wrote a book called The Newspaper.
And it comes off number 2 above, the actions that the member of a nation take when seeking to achieve or sustain self-determination.
So footnotes are more than the text. So there are little articles in the footnotes about, and they're.
Well, when I see the word self-determination here, I really think of Woodrow Wilson's points on really saying that group of people who have kind of a shared identity or see themselves as more similar as a group than maybe the wider populace have a right to form a nation that has complete authority over their own affairs. And
I think so.
but I'm kind of wondering with a lot of new things, whether self-determination maybe could be something less because it could maybe be applied more to the individual or to communities that are not full governmental organizations. So if there's a lack of government regulation, then maybe that allows for self-determination on smaller levels, and maybe you could grant a group of people who have common origin, ethnicity, or cultural ties to have self-determination without having full statehood.
So would you say that a group of people that go off and live in the woods in their own little village, is that a nationalistic movement?
I don't know that it would be called nationalistic, but I think there are many many examples that we might look at that seem to fit all the requirements, but wouldn't be called nationalistic. Like the Amish, who live separate, who really define their own rules, and that even the government has kind of had had to pull back and say, okay, we are going to like make certain allowances because these people are kind of pulling away from the national identity of Americans and defining it more strictly for themselves.
So would you say the Amish should be described as nationalistic, or that they are like a nationalistic movement but are not nationalistic?
It's hard to determine, especially with the scope of history, it's hard to determine because at the time of, pre-World War I, the nations that eventually came in the Balkans, or exist in the Balkans, they were all part of one and had their own had their own national identities as individuals, even though they were all one part of one country at the time. And then afterwards split up and were able to have their own identities. So it depends, like, I guess if the Amish decided to have their own government, consider themselves separate, and break away, that we would then say, oh, it was a nationalist movement. I kind of think it's one of those, historically speaking, it's hard to define it until it happens.
Would you say that they're nationalistic if and only if they aspire to have their own government?
I think that's hard to define. I think that I would feel comfortable saying that. I feel like nationalism is usually tied not only to government but actual land. So if they said we want to cede and this land will be Amish land and we will govern this area separately from anyone else, and that we could call a nationalist movement. But specifically with the Amish, I don't believe that they will do that, and that's why they're not considered nationalist, and that might be more tied to their disbelief in the importance of earthly things and governments than anything else, because there are many groups who do aspire to govern their own land, and I think that would be, for me, an important step if you're going to call something a nationalist movement.
So you'd say maybe when the Mormons originally moved to Utah and set up a Mormon state, then the Mormons were nationalistic. When they peacefully acquiesced to integration into the United States, they ceased to be a national movement?
I think that cease to be a national movement would be appropriate.
Are you guys happy with Curie's criterion that any group that aspires to govern their own land is nationalistic, has a nationalistic feeling?
Or a nationalistic attitude, I don't know about that. So with, like, I'm asking all of them, Native Americans, like, would that kind of, because they have their own laws and constitutions and like form of government, so would that be something that would be considered a nationalistic movement, or like were they national? Because you all did this yesterday, so maybe I can throw
No, it's a
it in.
great question.
So is that something that would be considered, like, would they be considered a nationalistic movement, or like nationalists themselves?
I come from upstate New York, and we read this the other day, so they do talk about the Iroquois in this. And in upstate New York, if you are Native American or belong to one of the Iroquois tribes, not only do you know which part of you belong to, or you also know, like, it's definitely nationalistic, because they're very proud of their heritage. They know what they come from. They know which members of their family were from the tribe and what their position in the tribe is, and they know a lot about it still, and it's still a very huge part of their identity. So I think it is
So
nationalistic.
do they voluntarily decide that, I mean, like, if, they have their own form, like, if they're nationalists, are they, like, talking about your Bosnian friends, so are they involuntarily American? Does that make sense? I'm just curious.
That's a great question. I think it's a great question.
Does that make them involuntarily Americans, but voluntarily, I mean, I know they're Native Americans, but you know what I'm saying? So it's kind of like the Bosnian who's involuntarily Native American, but then he voluntarily became American.
I think that you can kind of belong. It's hard because I think you can belong to a few like different backgrounds, and I think that that's part of like knowing your culture, and it's one of those how do you define yourself? So I think that they are involuntarily, and it's not necessarily involuntarily all the time. It's just they are American citizens, but they identify as Native American.
Well,
At least in my experience.
I think it's worth looking at number 2, where we just read, raises questions about whether self-determination must be understood as involving having full statehood with complete authority over domestic and international affairs, or whether something less is required. And so the Native Americans have some authority over their affairs, but not full sovereignty. So I think in this case, the question is, do they have enough control over their affairs to be considered a nation? Can we speak of the Iroquois nation, or would they need more autonomy? And you know, sadly, in a funny way, casino gambling and, you know, tax-free cigarette sales are the two markers. But is that enough to consider them nationalism, a nationalist, successful nationalist movement, or would they need more autonomy and governance of over their territory?
I think that if we're talking about the Iroquois nation and whether they have enough authority to be considered having statehood or self-determination, we should also maybe look at European nations who have handed over many of their decisions, especially in international affairs, economic affairs, to a broader
To the EU?
To the EU, and just said, and then do we consider states that do that, like Germany? Do they not have full statehood then? Because they are a state that also has connections to a larger group that helps make decisions, and maybe we should consider the Iroquois nation kind of like one of those who says we have self-determination in these areas, and we choose to participate rather than go to war with the larger body, because that's really what happened. Wars were fought for a long time, and then they said, okay, it's going to be better if we reach an agreement on what the Native Americans have power over and what we will compromise and agree that the American national federal government will have power over. But it's a very fuzzy area, and I think it's still kind of delineating who has power over what for them, because it is a national movement that the federal government has to deal with, and some people are probably more gung-ho in a traditional nationalist sense to see than others. Like Lindsay was saying, that some people maybe consider themselves voluntary Americans, and some people consider it a happenstance. That they
And
care
there's,
for that
so it sounds like you're sort of saying there's a continuum that insofar as, say, both the Germans and the Iroquois identify as distinctive nations, their nation, but insofar as they've delegated some of their sovereignty to higher governmental authorities, then they're no longer a complete nation. Then what comes up for me then is Texas. Is, you know, Texas was once a nation. There are some Texans who think of themselves, but I think most Texans think of themselves as Americans first, and Texans second. Would the test be, if somebody thinks of themselves as Texan first and American second, then they're part of the Texan nation?
I guess the question is, if Texas went to war with the United States, which side would they fight on? And that's how you know.
So insofar as Native Americans, by that criterion, if Native Americans fight for the U.S. government, then they're unambiguously no longer a nation.
If they fight against.
Right, but insofar as right now, I mean, I don't know of cases where they're fighting currently against the U.S. government, but insofar as they've joined the U.S. government, say, and go into Iraq or whatever, then they are Americans and not members of their own nation.
I don't think they give up their nationality if they're fighting for another nation. If we intervene in a country to fight for their rights or to protect them, I don't think that the French, in allying with the Americans, are saying we're no longer French because we're fighting for an American cause. They're saying we align ourselves but maintain our own identity.
I think in the point that you were making before, if the United States were going to war against the Native Americans, it would be whatever side they chose was what their national identity is. I think that's okay, yeah. So,
How about in the case of legal battles? Suppose a Native American tribe sues the U.S. government for more autonomy or over any issue. If they, say, support the lawsuit of their nation of their, say, tribal nation against the U.S. government, is that an indicator that they are more part of their tribal nation than the U.S. government? So instead of physical battle, legal battle?
that's hard to say, because I think that a lot of outsiders tend to side with one side or another in legal battles. That's more of a moral grounds rather than a national identity. I don't know if that.
Would that be like with, in Utah, where you can have more than one wife? Is that kind of like, that's their legal battle against the with the U.S. government and the U.S. government, you know, so you're siding with one side and the other, but you're not necessarily like joining one side or the other. Is that kind of,
Yeah,
yeah.
like legal battles, it's hard because it's, yeah, depends on what they're suing for. Like, you know, what is the concept, or, you know, what is the issue that we're taking? Is it something economic? Is it something governmental? Is it something, you know, just human rights? You know, what is the issue that we're battling for? I think we have to look at it individually.
Well, and then I'm wondering about the Mormon polygamists who, you know, some of them had a compound, and that's physical territory. Were they a nation?
I guess they thought they were probably at one point
Yeah.
they had their own, but can you really secede, like, from the United States, almost like Texas wanting to secede, you know, back in the day? Is that kind of what you mean?
Well, I'm looking for the criterion. Can you, at what point does something become legitimately a nation or nationalistic movement? The Basques want to secede from Spain. Are the Basques a real, and Catalonia, actually, Catalonia is talking about having a vote to secede from Spain. Are both the Basque and Catalonian movements legitimate nationalist movements? Or are they like the Mormon fundamentalists?
I think that as far as the Basques and the Catalonians, they've always pretty much had their own identity separate from Spain. Well, not completely separate, but they've had their own identity that isn't necessarily the Spanish identity. So I think that that's a nationalist movement in that way, that like they have a specific identity that's separate, and if it came to, you know, if they were going to have to go to war about it, most Catalonians would stick with, you know, because that's happened in different ways in the past, that they've stuck together.
So do you think that historical legacy is important, that if you have to be 5 centuries old to be a nationalistic movement or something, or 2 centuries old?
Not
or?
necessarily. I think that it helps us to define it, though, because that's the reference that we have to look back on to decide, you know, well, this is considered a nationalist movement, so this is similar and can be considered one. I don't know.
Did you figure it out in your own mind?
No, I was just saying that's a tough situation because I mean, who's one to say like what? I mean, just across the entire world, say, well, this isn't considered a national movement. These people have their own nation; they're good to go. Kind of like how America was born, in a way. Like, but it took all these battles, all these times, and who's to say? Because we have their own government. I mean, they're defining terms, but it's just one of those. I mean, it's hard for the Catalonians. It's hard for everybody in a way. If you're trying to birth your own nation, even when Russia divided up into his parts, and it had Serbia, who determined that Serbia was a nation. And what if someone like the United States doesn't want to recognize Serbia as a nation? Then what does that mean? I mean, of course,
Are they still a
believe
nation?
they're a nation. Yeah, and,
Are they still a nation?
Yeah.
Not everybody recognizes them
Well,
as a nation.
well,
Are they still a nation?
and you know, the United States is an interesting case because we say you have to be 500 years of a nation, and of course the American revolutionaries totally cheated. You know, there was some independent identity as colonial America, but you know, the British could say, you're British, you've always been colonial British, you will always be colonial British. What's this American, you know, heresy? So by that standard, if it's time, then we were completely illegitimate.
I find it interesting that Beth brought up recognition because I posed a question to my 9th graders when we first started doing geography, which is, the question was really, how many countries are there in the world? And the answer is, it depends on who you ask. And because, and I'm sure if you teach geography in 2nd grade, you very much would get those kinds of questions. How many states are there? Because that's the kind of information students love. They love to rack up lists and rankings. And so I asked them to go online and see if they could find the answer to the question, which is that there are 2 countries that the United States recognizes that are not UN member nations. And those 2 countries are Kosovo and Vatican City. And they're not UN member nations because there is a legitimate group of nations in the UN that does not recognize them. And then you get to, you can consider yourself a nation, you can have all the accoutrement of a nation and statehood and self-determination, but if you're not recognized as legitimate in doing those things and in taking those actions, then you are not a nation in some people's eyes. And so to some respects, it doesn't matter what the Mormons do or the Amish do or the Bosnians do. or the Serbs do. What matters is if people see their actions as legitimate and give them, grant to them by recognizing them as a state, or say, no, you can try to make your own compound and you can have your own rules and you can reject government services, but it doesn't matter because you are just a rebellious part of our nation because we don't recognize.
But then the question is, what if one other nation recognizes them, and then two, and then the three, and then four, and then five?
Then the definition may change.
Well, I think if
Yeah.
the allies, Western allies, turned against the United States and sided with the Mormons, they would have a hard case not to give them Utah and say, okay, we have to do something about this.
There's a ranch in Australia that refused to pay taxes and declared themselves their own nation. And they actually have their own corporate registry. And Hong Kong recognizes their whole corporate registry. Even though, you know,
Trading with them? I'm just asking.
well, the Australian
Commerce
government,
involved or something?
yeah, the Australian government thinks it's kind of a joke, but they haven't decided to crack down militarily. But, you know, there are, and then there are, in Somalia, Somalia has Somaliland, which has declared itself independent, and a number of nations have recognized Somaliland, but the U.S. hasn't. You know, they're all over the world. There are these jurisdictions where they're trying to bootstrap their credibility by recognition state by state. And then they have lobbyists. They have lobbyists trying to, you know, lobby to get recognition in order to get that credibility. Yeah, and then the question is exactly where do you draw the line? And if you're a congressman and the lobbyist is saying recognize us, when do you decide, yes, these are credible people and we should do it? Yeah. But I want to debrief. You guys have been through this before. I just want to have some time. So I would like to check in and see how the conversation went. What was the most engaging and least engaging aspect of our little conversation?
I like that it was a conversation because honestly, you know, in second grade, we have some deep stuff going on. Don't worry. But, you know, mostly what we're doing is repetitious facts.
Right.
And so it was really neat to actually get to like collaborate and talk with everybody. And this is something that we don't really get to talk about, and even as teachers, because you know, I don't know how it is in upper grades or lower grades. We don't even get to collaborate a lot with each other because we're just so busy. It's like you just keep going. You know,
Yeah.
Let's get through that hour and get those kids knowing their facts, and then we're good.
Yeah.
So thank you.
You're
I learned a
welcome.
lot from all of you.
I like the fact that everyone was so engaging and had a point to share. Like, didn't feel like everyone had an opportunity to get in on the conversation. So I definitely like that part, and that seems to be engaging for everyone. You know, everyone could have an opinion about you know, nationalism.
Right.
You know, depending on, it doesn't have to be dependent upon what is your knowledge of history or locations, but you know, bringing up the scenarios allows for people who aren't history majors to, you know, comment on different thoughts about nationalism.
Everyone seems to be ignoring them. What was I frustrated about? So I'm going to start with that,
Go
which
for
is
it.
the seating arrangement of our little
Thank you.
ensemble
Thank you.
here, which is, I guess, why when we do this in my classroom, even though it is time consuming, I have the students
Yeah.
move the desks because it's
Makes such a difference.
Yes, and this conversation was so different than yesterday, and even, I think different than Lindsay and I had imagined. We were given this ahead of time before our thing yesterday, so we were able to read it. And I think when you read through things, certain things stick out to you, and you think that that might be what you're going to discuss, and then when it goes in a different direction, it's really nice, and that's what I learn when I get to see. I teach the same class 4 times in high school, just one after another, and each one is so different, and it's nice to see that it happens with adults too. It's just it's a very legitimate to have the same document and go in different directions with it.
And it makes it fresh and fun to teach. Because, yeah, you never know. I always learn from students. Because if you have a rich concept like this, there's so many different directions. And, you know, just the examples, we could have spent the whole time talking about the Basques or the Mormons or the Amish or the Texans or the Somalis, you know, on and on and on, or the Europeans, you know, et cetera. Or, you know, things like taking action versus an attitude. There are just so many legitimate directions you can go, and lots to figure out.
My positive is like you guys were just talking about the different directions and things that I think my students will come up with, they don't, and things that I never thought that they would know about, they come up with, and as far as getting them to think deeper about content, it works very well, and I like that. seating arrangement is part of it.
Yeah, no, it's
My
terrible.
side hurts.
Yeah, no, it's terrible. It's terrible.
But I've learned with the circles in my group, it makes it harder for me to navigate because I tend to walk around while they're talking. But and for some reason, the two students that like to argue with each other sit across from each other.
Yes.
And they will. That becomes bad. I have to,
Well,
like, move them.
it's better than sitting right next to each other because then it's all off in a corner. I'm curious for the direct instruction. How do you see this as a huge transition for students to have to learn after being in direct instruction for years, for them to learn to do this, or there are ways in which they're being prepared?
I honestly, I have a third grader,
Mhm.
and I have a kindergartner, and as far as like the third grader knows a lot of facts.
Yeah.
That's good.
Yeah.
But as far as like thinking deeper, I have to be honest. Sometimes I'm like it's kind of a joke that you could say you can throw construction paper, and the kids in my grade will have no idea. It'll take them an hour to figure out what to do. And I kind of see that with my third grader, even through like novel studies that they're thinking about doing now. It just blows their mind thinking deeper. But I think they do a great job in the upper grades of making sure it's vertical. But it's so important to have that vertical alignment. Otherwise,
Yeah.
that they think deeper by the time they graduate. These kids are amazing.
Yeah. Well, and we're, we've had some, certainly with Timothy, I've had some conversations about middle school being a transition in particular. And would you say the middle school is already kind of helping students transition?
I think so. I feel like, personally, I feel like for a lot of, I have conversations with my sixth grade science
Right,
students, and we talk about, different concepts in
Right,
science.
right.
But I really feel like developmentally,
Mm-hmm.
it's more the 6, 7, 8 that are ready for this type
Yep.
of process,
Yep.
because they need to have a foundation to even have the conversation.
Yep.
If you don't know anything about nationalism, or you don't know anything about the geography of Europe, or
Yeah.
there has to be some sort of knowledge base for this to really make a great
Yeah.
conversation.
Yeah.
And I think it takes practice too, along with the students, and figuring out guidelines, and who shares next, and
Yeah.
just setting some ground rules, and then giving them an opportunity to have these conversations, because they are used to you presenting the information, and that's not just here, but how we struggle in middle school as well is we're having this conversation about language arts and
Right.
science, and as a team, we were just saying that the students can give you back what you asked for. Like
Right.
we do one program called Shirley English, which is grammar based, and it's very model driven. So when you do the model with them, they know exactly, because they know what kind of patterns come from these. It's identifying the grammatical structure of a sentence.
Right.
But when you throw a random sentence at them, they're all of a sudden flustered. Huh? What's that? Like, wait, we just did this, but
Right.
So it's when you give them start thinking critically.
Yeah.
The 6, 7, 8 is when you start to see it sort of emerge. I see more so in 8th grade. We had a lot of interesting conversations about Animal Farm, which is one of the novels I
Yep.
just taught.
Yeah.
And I try to explain to them, you read this in 2 different levels. Orwell was really upset in the beginning because they put his novel in the children's books, and he had a fit. He's like, it's not a children's novel. So, and engaging, them on 2 different levels, like finding the deeper meaning and discussing, some of the concepts and themes within the novel becomes a little more difficult, because they just want to tell you directly what happens.
Yeah. Yeah.
But what is the correlation to history? Because these animals are characters in history.
Yeah.
So it, that one I like teaching, because it really sort of opens them up for conversations about what is really here, in the text.
And they're ready because they can read really well. by the
Yeah.
time they get up
Absolutely.
there.
Yeah, no, and I think the developmental argument is exactly right. That developmentally, the direct instruction is great for the elementary, and but it's interesting to me because in one way, direct instruction is at one end of the spectrum, and the Socratic is at the other. And insofar as the high school is developing a serious commitment to the Socratic, then I think the process you're spontaneously doing in middle school, you may have to kind of be more explicit about that. And I'm not sure. Not knowing the classroom, realities exactly, but your example is helpful. But I expect over 6th, 7th, and 8th grade, you find ways as a faculty to go from this is the old model of learning, this is the new model of learning, and bit by bit we're going to have to get there.
I found it interesting. I have 9th graders, and so they came in so fresh, right? And I have FA students who are raised in the program, and then I have these students who just joined us for 9th grade, and I had one girl say, "Oh, it's okay to question and say,
Mhm.
wait, this isn't right?" And I
Mhm.
said, "Absolutely. If I went along and
Mhm.
I said the correct answer is C,
Mhm.
and I mismarked that, then you should come back and say, hey, I believe
Mhm.
that that's not
Mhm.
correct, and then present your evidence on how you know that." And I think that it doesn't matter the instruction they came from, but their
Mhm.
teachers' attitudes before about being
Mhm.
challenged and about
Mhm.
the nature of
Mhm.
truth. And it
Mhm.
doesn't, if you're teaching facts,
Mhm.
then that is absolutely fine.
Mhm.
But it's when maybe students find a discrepancy in
Mhm.
how the teacher handles that,
Mhm.
and how the teacher defines truth, and how we find
Mhm.
truth, and how we find out what is
Mhm.
correct when students run into those things seems more important than anything else. Because my students are in the 9th grade, and
Mhm.
they have trouble putting pieces
Right.
together. They know all these facts, but it's almost like they can't construct meaning out of
Right.
what they see as disparate facts.
Mhm.
And you really kind of watch them go, wait a minute, and you have to give them time to
Mhm.
take all these things that they have and to go, I can make something out of this knowledge
Mhm.
that I have. And they talk all the time about their previous teachers.
Mhm.
And they go, oh, I remember Miss So-and-so taught us this, and
Mhm.
oh, we learned all the states, and
Mhm.
oh, I know this, and they're like, wait a minute,
Mhm.
this information could be useful. And I don't know if they're ready to do that at a younger age,
Mhm.
but I think maybe showing them that it's even a possibility, and that their
Mhm.
teacher is not just asking for
Mhm.
what they say is the right answer, but they're actually looking for the right answer is really helpful.
And do you think that the parents are spontaneously understanding this transition, or do you think it's useful to explain to parents the kind of change in mental models and way of learning as the children get older?
As a parent, I think it should be explained,
Mhm.
just as a parent personally.
Mhm.
Like, I would
Mhm.
like to see and understand it more.
Mhm.
So, because I don't get to see as much in the upper grades. I know that Krista does sometimes.
I'm terribly sorry, but I'm presenting next, so I
Oh,
have to
please, go. Thank
Thank
you,
you.
thank you. Well, yeah, I'm in conversations with Tim and Melissa about these kinds of issues because I think it does need to be explained. Just because if parents are used to one model of learning, and then there's a shift to another model of learning, not only do you have to help the students transition in a developmentally appropriate way, but also you want parents to kind of understand. And some may spontaneously get it, but it might also be useful to have an articulated, this is why we're changing, these are what the developmental stages are, and this is the rationale for it, and that kind of thing.
Parents don't know, really.
Well, some of them don't even understand the curriculum.
Mhm.
Like you find that they're, after a certain grade level, they've forgotten the mathematics,
Right.
or they've forgotten the science concepts.
Yeah.
They just haven't used it in so many years, or because they're
Yeah.
sort of pigeonholed into their area of expertise,
Yeah.
whatever it might be. And you find too that you send home things, for the students to get accomplished, and parents say
Right.
they have to do it on their own. I don't understand how to do this. And
Yeah.
once you get to a certain
Yeah.
level, sometimes.
Well, also, some parents, if they have a certain kind of college education, where many liberal arts colleges, you're writing papers, defending, writing a thesis, defending ideas all the time, so that's normal. But if parents either didn't go to college or went to a more of a, accounting or engineering program, where you didn't do that, then they might not understand that, So yeah, so anything, if you have ideas along these lines, feel free to tell Tim or Melissa, and then we'll be in communication with them about how to communicate to parents about these sorts of things, as well as how to help the students transition. So great, thank you.
Thank you.
You're welcome.